Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 2 of the Bait Breakdown presented by the Tackle Talk podcast, a multi-part series where we take an in-depth look at the 4 major types of a bass's natural forage: baitfish, crawfish, aquatic insects, and reptiles and amphibians. On today's episode, we cover crawfish with special guest, Dr. Zach Loughman. Episode 2 of the Bait Breakdown starts right now.
Hello, everybody. I'm Bill Dance, and you're listening to Tackle Talk.
Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another very special episode of the Tackle Talk podcast, the second episode of our 4-part series, The Bait Breakdown. These 4 conversations will be brought to you with no ad interruptions after the beginning of the episode, so we do have to give a special thanks to the folks that made this whole series possible. First and foremost, American Legacy Fishing. ALF is the title sponsor of the Tackle Talk podcast for 4 main reasons. They have an incredible selection of high-quality fishing gear. They have extremely fast shipping times. They have the best prices that you'll find anywhere, and they have hands down the best customer service in the fishing industry. If you are looking for new or used gear, go check out American Legacy Fishing and see for yourself why they have one of the most loyal fan bases in the whole fishing world. If you're looking for anything from G. Loomis, Dobbins, Daiwa, Shimano, 13, Lew's, Megabass, so much more, go check out www.americanlegacyfishing.com. I cannot tell you how cool it is to get your guys' messages of your positive experiences with ALF, of everything that you guys have done over the past couple weeks and months. You've ordered from them for the first time, you've had great experiences, and that's really cool to hear. So I appreciate you guys going over and supporting them. You will not be disappointed. They are hands down the best retailer to deal with on the entire internet when it comes to fishing gear. So go over and check them out, www.americanlegacyfishing.com. All right, so let's get into today's episode. Last week, we covered anything and everything baitfish with Shane O'Gorman. So baitfish has been checked off the list here, and today we are moving forward to crawfish. And we are fortunate enough to have one of the crawfish guys in the country, Dr. Zach Loughman. So we talked to Dr. Loughman about craw behaviors, about habitat, colors, mating, movements, species, a ton more. So as always, this series is all about understanding the bait, understanding the natural forage of the fish that we spend so much time targeting. So let's get into it. I had a ton of fun making this episode. Dr. Loughman is a wealth of knowledge when it comes to craws. I hope you guys enjoy it. Here is our conversation with Dr. Zach Loughman. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are joined today by Dr. Zach Loughman of West Liberty University, biology professor. We are going to talk crawfish today. Zach, thanks so much for stopping by.
Thanks for contacting me. I'll talk about crawdads with anybody.
we always joke we're the same way about fishing. Like, I'll talk to a brick wall about fishing if I want to. So, so this is obviously one of our 4-part series of the Bait Breakdown, and your field of expertise is obviously crawfish. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of kind of the ins and outs of everything crayfish, do you want to hit us with your background on how you got into this, how you kind of became, I guess, the crawfish guy?
Yeah, I can do that. So my entire life, I've been a nature nerd. And spent a lot of time fishing myself. So, I know the angle that the podcast is coming from. But I decided very early on that I wanted to actually make zoology my career. And when I had parents that supported everything I did. And basically, we figured out that it was best for me to pursue academia. And so I went to West Liberty University, where I currently am a professor, and had a wonderful advisor there, and got my degree in biology. And the guy's name was Mr. Gordon. And Gordon basically let me go nuts. At the time, I wanted to be a herpetologist, which is reptiles amphibians. And I don't know if your audience can see, but here in the office with me, if you're wondering what's in those tanks, geckos and snakes and stuff like that. So didn't turn my back on herpetology, but I got my undergrad, went to Marshall, and when I was at Marshall University, I was studying reptiles and amphibians, and it became very apparent that there were a lot of other people studying reptiles and amphibians, and getting a job as a herpetologist is going to be very cutthroat, difficult to do. And my advisor at Marshall, Dr. Tom Polly, basically told me, hey, I watch you, pick an animal group that nobody else works with, find something that you can be passionate about with them, and then be the guy. and I dabbled with a whole bunch of different groups, but I kind of serendipitously ended up with Crayfish, and they fit the bill for me perfectly. All my training with reptiles and amphibians, small vertebrates, was directly applicable to a large invertebrate. And then I found out that there was literally nothing known about these things as far as their natural history and ecology was concerned. And that's what I needed. And so it fit that bill, and we'll leave the story at that. But that was all the way back in 2004, and I haven't turned my back on that. And I ultimately got my PhD at Indiana State. My dissertation was on the crayfishes of West Virginia. So I described new species of crayfish. I've studied them where we put radio transmitters on them and track them through the creek, kind of understand what a day in the life of a crawdad is. We've been my lab and I have been all over the country, pretty much everywhere but the middle and upper Midwest. We've done to East Texas, Georgia, the Carolinas, Maryland, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Arkansas, Missouri, Tennessee, like basically all those places studying crawdads and catching crawdads. And the best thing is, most fishermen and outdoorsmen, when they're little, catching craws is what you do. Like when you're 10 or 8, you go to the creek. That's what you're flipping rocks and catching these things. And it's crazy that I get paid to do that. Anyway, I can't complain. So that's my background. And it was the best decision I could have made because I love them to death. They're really interesting animals.
So a little bit of a humble brag here too. I read this. I don't know if it's up to date or if it's right or not, but when I was figuring out who I wanted to reach out to for this segment, it said that you had discovered and named, I think it was like 10 crayfish species over your career. Is that true?
Yeah, we're up to 15 now. And within the next 5 years, that's going to double. That's not really, though, to be humble about it. Since there's so few of us that actually have dedicated our professional careers to crayfish biology, when you don't have a lot of people studying a group, things go unnoticed. And one of the nutty things that I don't think the anglers listening to this realize is, one of the questions, when I tell people I study crayfish diversity, a lot of the times what I get is like, there's more than one? Like, yeah, there's more than one crawdad. There's about 400 species in North America alone. We have a project right now where when we're done, if we're able to publish all the different new species, it'll end up being, just from this one project, we're going to have over a dozen new species described. And these are great. And when we say new species, a lot of times people get kind of like prickly because I described a species of crayfish that lives in the mountains of West Virginia that's blue. And anyone that's grown up in Once by God knows about this blue crayfish. You go up to a place called Dolly Sods or Cranberry Wilderness, you're going to find it. And I got a lot of, when it was published in social media, a lot of people were like, that's not new. I've known about that my whole life. And that's absolutely true. What it is it's undescribed. That crayfish up in the mountains was masquerading underneath one scientific name, and the reality of it was completely different species. So a lot of these things anglers have been aware of much longer than the scientific community has. So, we all have our role to play, and fishermen absolutely have contributed in that regard.
Well, either way, even like you said, even if it's just a technicality almost on some of this stuff, it's still cool that you technically changed the way that from here on out science will look at a certain thing. Like I don't know, there's just a big picture of that's kind of cool. That's gonna be like, okay, it was maybe misunderstood or not understood well enough, and you helped create that. That's kind of cool. So obviously you've studied, you've identified, you've discovered, you've named, all this kind of stuff. I would safe to say that you're probably qualified for this conversation we're about to have from my level. So I'm very, very excited. So basically this series, I know I talked about this before we started recording, but we are trying to really learn the small nuances and the ins and outs of these things that we spend so much time trying to imitate. It seems silly that, I can tell you all this stuff about bass's behavior, but I know almost nothing about craw behavior, and I spend my entire day 8 hours imitating a crawl, and I don't know anything about it. So let's start with habitat. Habitat, I think, is something that interests me. Can you walk us through, I guess, the basics of where craws are going to be found in terms of maybe bottom composition, cover, current? Is there anything like that helps determine where in a body of water craws are going to be found more than others?
Yes. And when you talk about craws, we're not going to get too technical, but if you're from a fisherman's point of view, if you're fishing a lake, the crayfish that live in that lake are going to be in a different habitat than if you're fishing in a river. So if you're going after smallies in the New River, the crayfish there, which I can also tell you that's the main forage of those fish, is crawdad. They're going to be living in a very different habitat than if you're going for largemouth in a lake with aquatic plants. So if you're in a stream or a river, the crayfish are going to be in any kind of situation that has, just like the fish, abundant cover. And for them, what we're talking about are rocks. And not all rocks are created equal. Any kind of what I would refer to as a slab rock. So slab rocks are rocks that are kind of, they're flat, they're not rounded. And oftentimes when you get into a river, they'll kind of stack on top of each other. When they stack on top of each other, you get what we call an interstitial space, which is that space in between the rocks where it's open. And that is basically like the hotel or the condo, unit for crayfish. And so those interstitial spaces are absolutely critical. So if you've got a situation where you've got a lot of crevices and little cavities, you're going to get crayfish in there. And when it comes to streams here in Eastern North America, outside of the Ozarks, you have two groups of crayfish. And one of those is, we're going to get a little technical. Their common names, sometimes they're referred to as spiny crayfishes. Their genus name is Faxinias, and most Rapalas and lures that you're going to be, casting. When I go into Bass Pro and I look at the lures, I look at it and oh, that's the Faxinias. Everybody else is like, it's crayfish. But anyway, and these crayfishes are, if you look at like the total amount of crayfish in a unit area in a stream, most of the time they're going to make up 60 to 70% of the population of crayfish in a stream. It's a little different when you're in rivers that drain straight into the Atlantic Ocean, because there you have this other genus, Cambaris, but they fill that same niche that the Faxinias are filling. But those animals are usually what fish are feeding on if they're a bass, which is going to be an active site predator. And then if the river's clean, those animals reach insane densities. So if you've ever been in a stream or river and you watch the crayfish just kicking out in every direction, those are almost certainly members of that genus. And those crayfishes are gregarious. They aren't territorial or as territorial, so they'll live together. And that's how they're able to reach those really high densities. The other thing that's really cool about Faxinias is and you got a bunch of leaf pack in the bottom of the pool. You may not know it, but that leaf pack is probably infested with crayfish. And I've done a lot of work collecting crayfishes where we put on snorkels and are basically crawling up the creek in about 3 feet of water, because it's much easier to catch crayfish in those situations. And what's really fun when you do that is smallmouths will actually learn what you're doing very quickly, especially when you're flipping rocks and there's crayfish zooming out. And they'll actually like hang 2 feet to the left to 2 feet to the right. And it's almost like a race between me and the damn smallie to get the crayfish before they do. But when they do that, I've gotten to watch them a lot. And we'll get into a leaf pack situation in a pool, and you just kind of stop and watch. And the smallmouths will actually hang out about a foot or two above that leaf pack. And you watch them and they'll swim up the leaf pack, and then they'll turn around real quick and swim back. And their presence will startle the crayfish that are in that leaf pack. And they'll just zap them as they're moving around. And so in that situation, if you were to put some kind of lure through there that imitates crawdad, you're almost certainly going to catch those animals, because they have this behavior to basically, for lack of a better word, spook the crayfish into activity so they can get them. If you're in a lake, very different situation. If you have any kind of rocks in a lake, that's where the crayfish are going to be. But a lot of times you don't. You have a mud bottom or a sand bottom, silt bottom. And in that situation, especially if you're in the southeast, you're dealing with a whole different genera of crayfish. Procambarus is that genus. That's the genera that you eat if you go to New Orleans. So all the bayous of Texas and Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and most of Florida, that's the dominant genera. And those crayfishes are going to be on the bottom in shallow water, anywhere you got a lot of vegetation build up. So if you got lily pads or foxtail, coontail, whatever you want to call it, just veg, they'll be down in that, and they will do pretty much the same thing that the stream crayfish will do in leaf pack. So kind of a weighted question, where are the crayfish? It really depends on what you're fishing as to where they're going to be.
So you said something interesting there. So in a lake situation where you do have a deep lake, and you said most of those crawls are going to be, in the shallower water, which makes sense. That's where you see most of them. But then as anglers, we're out there dragging a giant crawl imitation football jig off of a 20-foot deep point. Are there crawls there too, or are they so concentrated up shallow that it's just like those fish down there know that, their instincts say to eat a crawl, there's one out of place, an easy one, they're going to eat it? Or are there crawls down on those real big, deep rock points as well?
There can totally be crayfish down there. They will be anywhere there's rocks. So if you've got the slab rocks on top of slab rocks on top of slab rocks in 20 feet of water, there will be crayfish down there. But if you've got a mud bottom in 20 feet of water, they will, if it's a compacted mud bottom, they will actually dig burrows down into that mud and live down in there, but they don't like that. They would much rather have a slab rock substrate. So like Lake Erie is a great example. If you go diving in 20 feet of water, and you've got that limestone that's kind of indicative of the Erie Basin, there will absolutely be crayfish down there. But if you go out onto the flats of Lake Erie where there's no rock strata at all, much more difficult to find them out there.
What about current? What does current do to them? Because I seem to see a lot of them. Now, obviously, you see a bunch of them in creek and river situations, so that's where they're most dense and where I see them anyway. But is there any certain pattern to more dense or less dense when there's current or less current?
Yes. Most crayfishes in a river or stream situation, they like what we call a run. So basically, they want there to be flow, but they don't want it to be torrential. So if you're in I was just in a stream all afternoon today. Imagine that. And we were catching crayfish left, right, and center. And where the water velocity wasn't what we would call a ripple, but it wasn't a pool either, that kind of intermediate run, that's where the crayfish want to be. Now, there are plenty of species, though, that have specialized for living in that high velocity water. And in that situation, they will not be exposed because not only do they have to deal with predators if they're out and about moving around, but they also have to deal with the fact that the water's moving fast and they have a hard time holding station. So a lot of species of crayfish have this really cool adaptation where if they're going to live in high velocity water, when they pinch their claws together, there is actually a great big gap or chasm. And what these crayfishes do is they walk up the stream facing directly up current, and they hold their claws at different angles, and the water actually goes through that hole in their claw, and they can tweak their claw, and it bends the water, moves the water, so it goes up over their head and then straight down onto their back. So it literally pins them to the bottom of the river. And so they're able to walk up through that riffle and not go flying downstream. And that's how they're able to exist there.
So they make themselves as aerodynamic as possible and just hug the bottom.
Exactly. Exactly. They're and that's the thing, when people say there's more than one crawdad, and I'm sitting here thinking, there's 20 species that have this one adaptation. That's what makes them so interesting to a scientist like me, is that they really do change their shape and form in response to the environments that they're living.
So let's move to species. You touched on species a little bit. This is a part of craws that obviously I know zero about. I'm the dummy that looks at it and goes, yep, that's a crawfish. That's about the extent of my knowledge. But are there very different craws in, say, you're in West Virginia right now. So say you're in West Virginia and say there's someone listening to this right now that's in Oregon. What percentage of those craws cross over and are fairly similar? And what percentage of those are nowhere near the same?
So it's funny you picked Oregon. If you're in the Pacific Northwest, so basically mid-California up into British Columbia, Vancouver, those are actually the crayfish that live out there that are native, and we'll get into invasive and native species certainly here in a minute. Those crayfishes are completely different than our crayfishes that are over here east of the Rocky Mountains. They're in a totally different family. They can get to be larger. They live in water that's much colder, as a general rule. and they have a coloration that's very unique to them. They're usually just a brown color to an orange-brown color. And there's one species out there called the signal crayfish that has this white dot on its claws that's very enigmatic, and it's like the classic Pacific Northwest crayfish. When you come over here through the Rocky Mountains, there's a couple species that live there, but you don't get that much diversity there. And then when you drop down into like the plains and the southeastern U.S. and the Midwest, the Northeast, Ontario, Canada, that's where that epicenter of diversity is. And basically, there are a handful of places that have a unique crayfish fauna. So if you're in what we would call the Gulf Coast, the coastal plain across from East Texas through all the way over to Florida, that's going to have a fauna that is basically going to be composed of that genus Procambris. And most of those crayfishes, not all, but most of those are going to be a reddish brown, a red color. There's one very prevalent species group that is basically that red swamp crayfish. That's the guy you eat. That's where the red crayfish idea comes from. When you move your way north from the Gulf, you get into the Ozarks. The Ozarks and the Wahita Mountains have their own fauna, and their fauna of crayfishes is based primarily on this genus Faxinaia. And those are those crayfishes that reach real high densities, and they can be quite colorful, and then others are just brown. And it's thought that one of the ways they tell each other apart is through chemistry and signaling. So contrast is super important for those animals. And then when you make your way over into the Appalachians and the Midwest and the Northeast, and then the Atlantic slope, so basically Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and then parts of Georgia. The genus that's there is this genus Cambaris. And those animals are the kind of big, bad crayfish. If you catch a crawdad and you're like, oh my God, it's a lobster, and you're in that part of the world, you're almost certainly collecting a Cambaris unless you have an invasive. And those animals are different as well. And, a lot of people might be like, oh, well, who cares? A crawdad is a crawdad. I can flat out tell you as the crayfish biologist who has literally flipped hundreds of thousands of rocks in the past decade and a half. A lot of times we catch the crayfish, we release them, and the way that the fish respond when the crayfish hit the water, a lot of times, like here in Appalachia, they'll go after a Cambaris, that big burly guy, and then it's almost like they realize, oh, it's you. I don't want to mess with you because you can defend yourself. And then they'll stop pursuing that animal, and then they'll see a Faxinaia, and they're like, oh, I can pound you. And the next thing you know, all those guys are just getting obliterated. So if you're a fisherman and you're fishing a pattern that's indicative of Cambaris, they're not going to bite it. Whereas if you throw out that Faxinaia pattern, they're going to be all over it. And so that's why a little bit of biology, I think, goes a long way as far as angling is concerned. And unfortunately, I cannot remember the guy's name, but I worked with a guy out of the Pacific Northwest who was making lures, and he was hand painting these lures, and he really wanted to know what species were what up there, because he said, like, I just caught a crawdad and I imitated the pattern, and I was able to catch fish after fish after fish with this pattern. And then I had another pattern, and all I left off was that white dot, and none of them would touch it. And so, that to me was the best evidence ever of that pattern does matter. But then again, you're also going to have a bass that's just going to eat whatever the hell is in front of it, because they do that too.
So to dumb bass guy right here, you just described obviously I think you said the Cambaris, the one that can defend itself, the little bit burlier one. Mm-hmm. What are, for us, the indicative traits of that, where you're saying, if I'm holding up 2 jigs or 2 craws, what's the difference to me, simpleton, of like, this is the one they want, this is the one they're scared of? That's
super simple. The overall body plan of the jig is what matters. So that group that the bass are eating, their body plan is very sleek and hydrodynamic. Okay. Whereas these other guys are these big burly animals that you look at and you're like, okay, that thing can put up a fight. And that's basically it. And I've watched these things underwater, and they can. I've totally watched them. Like, you let them go and you got that erratic movement of the crayfish when it's released, and that will draw the fish in, and they'll chase it. And then that crayfish hits the bottom of the creek, and is able to like do its defensive posture. And as soon as it does that posture, the bass realizes, oh, it's you. It's almost like it was attracted to movement, but then it realized, it's that one. And then it just kind of swims off. So they're definitely cueing into that.
So it sounds like it's just kind of overall size. When we talk about like bulking up a jig or something like that, not always a good thing.
Yep.
Got it. So one thing I wanted to ask you about too, and I know when we had our very initial conversation a while back, you had mentioned this, and it's something that it was a buzzword that I've always heard. And again, just I don't fish live bait, so I don't know a lot of this stuff. But you hear the old guys around here talk about their soft craws, and you talk about these they seem to be like the just the like golden thing that old guys want to fish with. Like when they're looking for craws, they're like, I've got soft craws, they're worth their weight in gold. What is the difference between soft craw and kind of like regular craw that's in there? And is there anything that anglers need to know about those two things?
Absolutely. So, and your segue was beautiful because every crayfish has to molt to grow. Okay. And we just got done talking about those Canberras that are these big burly animals, and they can defend themselves. There is one time in their life when they are completely defenseless. And that is basically immediately after they molt their exoskeleton. And when they do that, they go from being these like little tanks to a pile of goo. And what happens is biologically, they expel that exoskeleton, and they then have to take calcium carbonate that they have inside of them in this little structure that's right off their stomach, where they basically hoard calcium carbonate right before they're going to molt. They molt, and then they start to digest that structure. And as they're digesting it, that's going to go back into their exoskeleton and harden them up. But for about, depending on the species, it could be as little as 24 hours. It can be as long as 72 hours. They can't defend themselves at all. And they release a chemical during this period of time that fish that are very chemically oriented, things like catfish are a great example. They can smell that, sense it, and they lose their damn minds when they pick up that scent, because they know if I can find this thing, it's defenseless and it's probably a large meal, especially if it's one of those great big Canberras. So fish and crayfish have had this predator-prey interaction for literally eons, and it gets around this molting. So yes, that is not a wise tale. There's a lot of truth behind that, and doesn't matter what species of fish it is, they will go ape over a soft-shell crayfish. One thing that I have heard a lot of people say is like, well, I went down to the creek and I got a bunch of crayfish and I know how to make a molt. Then you know something that I don't. Because in aquaculture, that is a magical thing, because aquaculture facilities have tried for eons to figure out how to induce molting, because if you could rear these things in mass and have soft craws on demand, you're going to make millions of dollars. And when you go to Bass Pro, you can't do that. So here in the Mid-Atlantic, the Midwest, our genera of crayfish, they're going to molt in the late spring. They're going to molt this time of year, actually, going into the fall. And that genus Vaccinius, they all molt at once. There's like a 2-week window of time. And it's a strategy that's identical to what the 17-year cicadas do. Basically, they know they're going to be weak, so they all molt at once, and then the fish get fat off the first round of molters, and then they basically like, I don't want to eat anymore for a little while, and then that second wave of molters molt, and they're able to make it and survive and reproduce and keep population going. The genus Canberras, they're different. They will all molt over a 2-month period of time, and they'll go underneath a rock and sequester themselves and backfill the burrow, make sure nobody can get to them. So that's what's happening in a creek. If you're in a pond, it's a very different situation, because those procambrous crayfishes, they grow very fast, and the molting is related to growth. So there's always going to be some part of the population, if the water's warm, molting. And so if you put in your time, you can almost certainly find, soft-shell crayfish in a pond any time of the year. But it's a little bit different when you're up here in the Midwest, Mid-Atlantic, Appalachia, places like that.
Got it. So Is there any negative side? I've heard before, obviously, and I think, I can't remember if it was you or not, they may have mentioned it before, that sometimes this need for soft craws introduces species of craws into bodies of water that do not need to be there, or if it's just maybe not the soft craws, but it's just transporting craws in general. Can you touch on just because I know there are some invasive species of craw, and I know, especially for someone like you that spends their whole time studying these can be a problem. And to us, again, just going to go back to dumb bass angler, like it may not seem like a huge deal, but there are repercussions to any sort of invasive species. So can you touch a little bit on, I guess, where we're at in terms of invasive species with craw, how it happens and how we either prevent it or we need to be, I guess, cognizant of it at least?
Yes. This idea that a crayfish is a crayfish is a crayfish, I understand how it can be frustrating to an angler who doesn't understand crayfish biology. And they're like, well, I need bait. I'm going to catch the bait in my local creek here in West Virginia, and I'm going on a fishing trip in North Carolina, and I'm going to take them with me, and get that part of the trip out of the way. But if you introduce certain species of crayfish into other water bodies, it can have an insanely deleterious effect on not only the native crayfishes in that watershed, which is what I'm out there sampling and surveying, but it can ultimately literally cause a trophic collapse, which is basically the entire food web can implode if you introduce certain species of crayfish that have certain characteristics associated with their biology. If you introduce a crayfish that breeds a lot, has a lot of young, and can reach sexual maturity really fast, that's a problem. And some examples of those are the red swamp crayfish, which is the one that is in the southeast. I've said that now like 3 times. Another crayfish called the rusty crayfish, which is a crayfish that has a big maroon dot on its carapace. And then a third one is the virile crayfish, which is this great big, well, it's funny. Where it lives in the Midwest and in the Ozarks, it's actually not that big of a crawdad. But when it's introduced into places like Appalachia, where I live, it actually becomes the largest crayfish you're going to bumble into when you're out looking for these things. And the issue with these animals is multifaceted. One is when you release these animals into the water. So you're done at the end of the day. You got a couple that have survived. You just dump your bait. That's what's called a bait bucket introduction. Those animals, if they've mated, female crayfish maintain a sperm packet, so they aren't spawners. They basically get inseminated, kind of complicated. We're not going to get into that. But you release them. They then produce eggs. You can, by releasing that one female, release 800 crayfish, and you don't realize that. That's how many eggs these things lay. And those 800 crayfish, she may have had many baby daddies associated with that clutch of eggs. So you're releasing a whole bunch of half brothers, half sisters, which can then breed with each other. And there will be a little bit of inbreeding, but there's really not as much inbreeding as there would be with other animals in this scenario. So you can quite literally, with one crayfish, create an entire population. And what those animals do is the invasives will run around and the little guys eat aquatic plants. And this is really important. If you're in a lake, where do the bass bed? They bass in the macrophyte bed, the plant bed, and things like that. Virile crayfish, I've studied introductions of virile crayfish where I was on the ground within a year of them being introduced. And I'm talking about a fishery that was loaded with bass because there was a plethora of aquatic plants. Those virile crayfish young ate the plant, and it basically was no different than clear cutting a forest. And when those crayfish became adults, all the plants are gone because they ate all of them. The following year, there's no bass bed. And so so that's why this stuff matters. It's not, a crazy animal lover jumping up and down, screaming and doing all kinds of crap. It's legitimate management. Most of my funding comes from people that are in fisheries that are basically like, oh crap, like this is a problem. And a great example of this is I was doing a project in Virginia, and I found a crayfish in the upper James River, and I was like, what the hell are you? I've collected here for my whole career. I don't know what you are. We actually thought it might have been undescribed, and we ended up doing a lot of science. We were able to figure out that this crayfish was actually a crayfish called Saxonias ozarki. It was the Ozarks crayfish. And we went all the way to Arkansas, Missouri, and collected crayfish there. And we used genetics to pinpoint the point of origin of these crayfish in the Upper James. And it turns out that the genetic fingerprint of our crayfish we were finding in Virginia was identical to the Strawberry River Ozarkie, and I think that's in Arkansas. And there is a massive trout distributor that comes out of the Strawberry River that was bringing trout from there to the Upper James in Virginia. And basically what they would do is they would throw some crayfish in the tank, and the crayfish would eat the dead trout fingerlings as they were driving the truck. And when you open up the truck, everything in the tank goes out into the river. And now I was just, my students were actually back there, and they're like, the bottom is crawling with Ozarkie. They're freaking everywhere. And the macrophytes and parts of that river are gone. The smallmouth fishery has gone. Even though it's not gone, it's definitely been impacted, because you can also reach a point where there's too many crayfish for the fish. And where are the fish bedding? They're bedding on the substrate, and they can't keep the craws out of the damn nest, so they end up eating the eggs. So, you can say that there's been plenty of fishermen that get upset when regs come into play about bait, but this is one that I actually feel is needed. And this is all you do. This is literally the secret. Catch your bait where you're fishing. If you go there and you get your freaking crawdads out of the lake that you're fishing in, A, the bass know those crawdads. Those are the crawdads that they're honed into chemically. B, you're not going to introduce anything, so it's not your fault when the whole fishery collapses later on. and C, you might actually catch a fish with those crayfish. So that's just basically it. But another thing, in the crayfish world, we were freaking out because last year, I won't name names, but an extremely well-known bass fisherman was talking about how he stocks his lakes with crawdads, and he drives into New Orleans and buys 300 pounds of crayfish, and then he comes over to Texas and then cuts the bottom of these bags open and just dumps them into these ponds. And I understand what you're doing there, but as a crayfish biologist, that is a literal nightmare.
Yeah.
That's like watching a slow moving train wreck where people are dying, because you're basically, the crayfish that was being introduced is a well-known invasive. It's one that's been known to cause all these problems. And it was being introduced in a part of Texas where it's not native. So you can absolutely get into problems. And these things are tough. There's been studies done where these crayfish were put onto hooks to see if you do a cast where you close the bail and you kind of catapult them into the lake. We've all done that. Do they survive their abdomens being ripped like that? And the story of that is, yes, they absolutely do. They can lay eggs after that. They can have a third of their bodies ripped off by a fish. They can have their legs and claws ripped off, and they live. So, these things are tough, and there's plenty of watersheds where you can, proof. If you want to see this in action, go to the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania, because the rusty crayfish has been introduced there, and the benthic community near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, it's just been annihilated by these crayfish. There are quite literally what would likely equate to tons of rusty crayfish, and it's just completely shifted the ecology of that stream. And that's the direct result of bait busting. So at the end of the day, what I tell everybody is, especially if you're buying the crayfish, and I do not recommend that, but if you're going to, I get it, just don't let them go. Put them on the deck of your boat. Think about someone you don't like and turn them into paste. Just do not put them in the water body. You are not doing anybody any favors if you just, you feel bad for the crayfish at the end of the day and you let it go.
So obviously there's the duh moment of yeah, you shouldn't go down to Louisiana and take the toughest crawdad in the world and bring it to somewhere, where it's not native. But is there any danger? So around here in Dayton, Ohio, we have 5 rivers that are all probably within, 10 minutes of each other. Is there any chance of taking a crayfish from one river that's that close to a different river and introducing it and having any cross-contamination? Or is it hey, you're all in this, Miami Valley here, you're all close enough in geography that's not going to be an issue? Or could it literally be taking a crawdad from a river, putting it in a pond, and that could be detrimental. How touchy is it?
Pond is different, but if you go, like if you're in the Miami River watershed and you go from one stream to another, you drive up over the ridge or the drainage divide, absolutely horrible. That's like me as the crayfish guy does a full body cringe. Just if you're going to fish in one stream, get the crawdads out of that stream. And it very well could be invasive. Like where you are, this has actually happened. The rusty crayfish is taking out a crayfish there that's known as Sloan's crayfish. And it's state endangered in Ohio because of bait bucket introduction. And another thing that we can address real quick, because I've been on the stream bank and been confronted with this question, which is, well, a crawdad is a crawdad. Who the hell cares? There have been plenty of studies that show that is not a true statement. When you introduce these invasive crayfish or introduce crayfish to a new watershed, those species that are that cause these deleterious effects, they are very different behaviorally. They are very different what we call trophically, which means what they're feeding on and eating. And you could, in theory, take a crayfish and introduce it to another watershed, and it might be a weak species of crayfish, and it's just going to die. But we just don't want to risk it because the ecological impact can be so extreme that it's just not worth risking it. So if you're fishing in a watershed, in a river, I shouldn't say watershed. If you're fishing in a stream, get the crayfish from that stream. It's just that simple.
Got it. And for us fish guys, it's probably easier to think of in terms of like we have invasive fish that we're all freaking out about. You have like your Asian carp or the silver carp, whatever ones that are on the Mississippi River flying up and hitting dudes in the face because there's millions of them. It's like that's probably what's happening to the crayfish. They're just subsurface and we don't interact with them as much, so we don't see the results of it.
That is one. That absolutely. Getting hit in the head by a 20-pound big mouth carp, that gets your attention. But when you go to your local lake and you can't catch bass anymore, that gets your attention too. And there are absolutely places where this has happened. So there you go.
So let's talk colors. Colors is one of those things I feel like I'm probably misinformed on, and I probably know a lot of wives' tales about the colors of crawfish that probably aren't true. But I know even around here, we get a rainbow of colors of crawfish around here, all out of the same river. So I have to assume, just an educated guess, it's species, molting, mating, temperature. I'm sure all that stuff kind of plays a part in color of those craws. But can you, I guess, kind of give us a quick rundown of why they're across different colors? Is there any method to the madness of why they're colors certain times of year? Or, in the fall, do you typically see more burnt orange and red versus a different time of year you see darker colors or anything like that? Is there any sort of method to the madness there?
There is some method to the madness. With crayfish, there is some evidence now that the color, like I said earlier, I think, color patterns may be used in species recognition. So crayfish can see, obviously, they've got eyes, but we don't really have a true understanding of how good their vision is. But what we do know is they recognize contrasting patterns. So if you look at a crawdad, a lot of times there is this groove that's right in the middle of that carapace part. So you got the tail, that's the part that you would eat if you're eating a crawdad, and you got that head part that all the legs and the antennae and all that kind of come out. That we refer to that as the carapace in crayfish land. So running right up the middle of that is this groove called the cervical groove. And there's a lot of species of crayfish that will have dark coloration along that groove. And then in front of it and behind it, there'll be the same light color, or one species might have a like gray, and then the other species has blue behind a black band around that groove. And if you're a fish, when they become familiar with the local crayfish in their stream, it's reasonable to assume that they're able to kind of hone in that contrasting pattern equals this thing that I can eat. So that's important, I would say, for anglers. One thing that a lot of people don't realize is when the crayfish's molt, that exoskeleton becomes hardened, there is a plethora of organisms that will grow on that carapace. So it's called biofouling, and basically it'll get covered in brown algae and protozoa and fungi, like all kinds of crazy stuff, paraphyton. and that will actually obscure that color pattern. So I do a lot of work in southern West Virginia where there's a lot of impacts to the streams from coal mining, and there's manganese down there. And when I go down there, a lot of the fishermen that we bump into inevitably when we're in a creek are like, well, what's the black one? Well, in that situation, there is no black crayfish. That's an example of this fouling where they're in water that has manganese in it. And basically the manganese hits their exoskeleton and gets deposited and makes them all black. So I've had a lot of people, especially here in Appalachia, be like, well, what's the red one? We actually don't have any red ones. What that is that's iron deposition on the exoskeleton of the crawdad. And it doesn't matter if it's what genus, all of them are going to turn red inevitably until they molt. And then they molt and you get that fresh color pattern back again. And it seems like there's multiple species when in reality it's the same species. So you also have this biofouling effect. But as a general rule, you're going to have the prettiest crayfish are going to be present, or not necessarily the prettiest, but the crayfish that have their natural patterns. That natural patterns will be present in the early to mid-spring, and then summer-ish, end of summer, midsummer, when these molting events are happening. Because as soon as they molt, they lose all that biofoul, and they go back to their normal pattern. Another thing that happens with crawdads is their diet does impact how colorful they are. They, like a lot of animals, eat plants, and plants have these things in them called carotenoids. That's where the word carrot comes from. And carotenoids are reds and browns and oranges. And if they have a lot of carotenoids in their diet, they will be kind of vibrant in their coloration. If they're denied carotenoid, they will oftentimes turn blue. So you can have any species of crayfish can have a blue morph. That's why they're so prevalent in the pet trade right now. You can go to Petco and buy an electric blue lobster for like $85. It's the exact same crawdad that you buy at the fish market, and you're going to eat it. It's just a species. It's a genetic mutation that makes it blue, like an albino. So blue patterns are something that's kind of unique to crawdads, and that's why we have so many that are bluish, blue, purplish, blue-green, aqua. Those are colors that are real common with crayfishes because they kind of lean that way, especially if carotenoids are denied from their diet.
So you're telling me that I was looking for an easy answer there of like for me as an angler to say, oh yeah, in the fall they turn orangish brown and stuff. You're telling me to sack up and go to my local creek and river and figure out what color they are, because the ones in the headwaters of the river could be different than the ones at the bottom, depending on their food sources, depending on what their carotenoids and what they have and stuff like that. There's no easy formula or common knowledge to say, hey, this is what color they're going to be this time of year in this location.
I don't think so.
Interesting. Yeah.
Darn it. If I were fishing a crawdad pattern, wanting a bass to hit it, I would fish a lure that had a lot of contrast to it. So I wouldn't necessarily throw something that was like chartreuse or brown, but maybe something that has a saddle in the middle of it, like a black band, or that's a light brown with a black band. Because what that's going to do is that's going to imitate that group of crayfishes that is always going to be predated on by bass. And the bass in that situation are going to see the contrast, think it might be that species, and then hit it. So that's what I would.
So there's a reason that a black and blue jig is probably the most popular jig color of all time. There is some biology to that.
A total biology of that. 100%. Mm-hmm.
So then what about the flip side? What about, you said obviously like candy to bass is a freshly molted crawl, a crawl that is defenseless. What color is that crawl naturally? Is that kind of a just gross light colored crawl? And if so, then obviously the contrast thing goes out the window, but scent maybe becomes a little bit more important. Have they found a way to bottle that that freshly molted crawl scent just yet?
People have said well, actually there is a chemical derivative that is that has been kind of, I don't know how to say this properly. There's a chemical that almost all crustaceans produce when they're molting, and you can purchase that, but we're talking like you got to get it from a biological supply chain, not necessarily Bass Pro. So
this isn't the Jack's Juice spray that we're using.
No, I don't think it's that. But no, the fish do cue into that. In fact, anything that's eating a soft shell craw is going to eat that. And most soft shell crayfish, when they molt, are deaf. Their colors are absolutely muted. And part of the reason why is when they shed that exoskeleton, a lot of the carotenoids you've been talking about are released in the exoskeleton. So when they start to basically feed again, once their exoskeleton's hardened up, that's when they get their carotenoids back, and they will become brighter and brighter and brighter as they feed post-molting.
Got it. So one of the last things I wanted to talk about here is behavior. First off, their movement. I think we've all seen craws swim before, and when they are fleeing or when they're escaping something, you know, whether it's really fast or really slow, they have this kind of pumping action to them because obviously their tail's propelling them. Do you ever see any sort of motion that's not got that pump to it from a craw?
They will do a very slow and deliberate walk across the bottom of a stream.
Okay.
That kind of swimming backwards with their tail is always associated with the startle response or fear. So they're basically like, oh, hell no, I need to get the hell out of here. And that's why they're moving like that. But they will do a somewhat deliberate kind of prowling walk up through the stream bed. And when they do that, they're going to be walking through those interstitial spaces. So if you were to do an action on the river bottom, that's going to be like that. And then every now and then jig. What they will do is if they bounce into something and they get a chemical cue that they don't like, they'll do a real quick flip of their abdomen up into the water column and then kind of slowly come back down with their claws out to face whatever the hell they just bumped into. And I imagine that action, if they happen to be doing that near a smallmouth, the smallmouth's going to destroy them. So that's definitely something that I would say that would be worth pursuing. And another thing is, we, like I said earlier, we put radio transmitters on the big burly crayfish, Canberras. And a lot of people were like, why the hell are you doing that? These things live under rocks. Everybody knows that. They find a rock, they live under it, they die, we're done. That is not what they do. These animals, about an hour after dark, not all of them, but a portion of the population, they go on these nightly strolls. And if you go out at night with a flashlight and look at a river, you'll see crayfish moving around. Everybody knows that. But the distance they're moving is crazy. Some of these critters in a night are moving 100 meters, 200 meters upstream. I did a study in West Virginia in this wonderful place called Anthony Creek, part of the Greenbrier River watershed, which is arguably the best river system in the state. And we were studying those invasive crayfish, and we wanted to know, like, how far do they move? Because if you know how far they move, you understand the invasion dynamic. So we caught a bunch of really big animals, and these things were pushing 9 inches, 10 inches total body length. They were huge. And we glued these transmitters underneath their claws, and then we just basically would find out where they were in the morning, leave them alone all day, let them go at night, and then track them the next morning, and then measure the distance. And we had one animal move what equated to 3/4 of a mile in 5 days. So, like, this is an active animal. So they didn't move at all during the day, but as soon as it started to get dark, they're just out cruising around. So I don't think fishermen realize how active they are. This was during the summertime when the water temperature gets below 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Crayfish activity, as a general rule, tends to just cease. And what those animals are going to be doing is they find rocks, they get up underneath them, and they basically hibernate when the water gets to be that cold. So that's another thing. If you're presenting, now granted, I don't know how many fish are active at water temps like that, but if you're presenting a lure at that temp, it could be lucrative because you're going to be imitating the idiot crayfish that doesn't know what the hell's going on and just decided to, buck its evolution and be active right now. But then again, I don't know if the fish are biting at that temperature either. So there's that. But yeah, the only thing that stops the movement is cold water. That's it. Really cold water.
That's always the fun dynamic of trying to understand what we're doing as anglers, because half of your brain says do the most natural thing possible, and the other half of your brain says do the exact opposite of the natural thing, so you look like the dumbest, crawfish or frog or whatever in the water system. So it's one of those things too where it's like there's no real right or wrong way to do this. We're always just trying to add more stuff to our tool belt and at least understand why we're choosing to do one or the other. But one thing you said was really interesting. I always just assumed that popping a jig was one of those things that we do as anglers because it gives us something to do. It pops, you you hopefully get the attention of something. But I never really thought of that as a natural crawl thing to do. It was just more of like, hey, look, I'm here, give it a pop every once in a while. But you're telling me that a crawfish will be on its strut and, run into a rock like it runs into a door at night and just bounce right up.
There's way more biology in fishing than anybody knows.
Than we know.
That's why some of the best fishermen I know are biologists. So, yeah.
Interesting. So, last thing, obviously, I wanted to talk about here, and you kind of touched on it a little bit. I have some questions on just the nuances of kind of what we have going on around here, but you touched on times of year where if, gun to your head, when do you fish a crawl? You talked about spring, you talked about kind of early summer, and when these crawls are a little bit more active and stuff like that. Are there, I guess, anything to say that different times of year they're a little bit, I'm assuming mating has something to do with this too, but a little bit more likely to venture out into that open water versus staying so reclusive? Like, do they get a little bit more strut your tail feathers during mating season or, things like that?
So there's 2 times a year where I would argue the overall population dynamics get a little bit stupid. And what I mean by stupid is that they stop caring as much about being in cover, and then they expose themselves to predation. Now, this does not work everywhere, but if you're in the mid-Atlantic, most of the Midwest, not all of it, but most of it, and then parts of Appalachia, for that genus Faxanias, which is the genus I keep coming back to that the bass are going to be feeding a lot on, those animals, their mating season begins late summer and is present throughout most of the fall. And a male crayfish is one of the most sex-crazed animals on planet Earth. They don't give a crap about anything else but, finding a female. And if they get in the presence of a female, they will oftentimes do some pretty stupid things, expose themselves to predation, and then get eaten. So if you're, fishing that time of year, the bass are expecting it. But there's another thing that happens, especially in the mid-Atlantic and Appalachia, where you have a resident species of Faxanias, and that is when the young of the year get to be about an inch long and enter the population, it is absolute crawdad carnage in the river because you have all these dumb baby crayfish that don't have an understanding of anything, and you've got hundreds to thousands of them entering the stream at once. And we did a study in southern West Virginia where we were electrofishing, and we were looking at the diet of trout that were being introduced, and we were also looking at smallmouths and rock bass, native fish, because there's a endangered crayfish we do a lot of work with, and the question was posed, if we introduce trout into the waters that have the endangered crayfish, is that going to hurt the endangered crayfish? And so we were comparing these stock fish with native fish, which were the bass. And right when the native Faxanias babies started to get big enough for the bass to care about them, the bass diet shifted to almost 100% crayfish. It went from eating whatever they could find, minnows, the occasional frog, and crawdads. Crawdads were always there. But when those young hit that population, it was crazy how many little baby crawdads we would make the fish regurgitate, called gastric lavage. And, you have a decent molly, they might have 10 to 20 of these crayfish in there. There were animals where we caught them and the students were like, these things are gravid, they're pregnant. They weren't pregnant, they just eat so many freaking crawdads that they were swollen. And so that time of year, right now actually is that time of year, they just become like the dominant forage. But it takes the right river system, it takes the right population dynamics, but if you have that, they will absolutely be the golden bait. Because, that's just the way it's going to go down. So
interesting. And my very, very last question here is a selfish one for me because I am in a giant bowl where we have 5 rivers and a very low watershed here where we just blow out and flooding happens all the time. And it's like, most people probably freak out if they saw the flooding we have around here, but it just happens every month or so. But what does that do to crawls? Because obviously when you walk the bank after one of these big flood events, it's a war zone of just dead crawls everywhere. And does that do anything to the crawl behavior, population, when that current is so bad and it's just a up 10-foot type of flood? Do those crawls just hunker down and not go anywhere? Do they get swept all over the place and kind of become easy targets as well?
I think it depends on where you are in the country. So if you're in an area where you have like classic river systems, like here in West Virginia or you in Ohio, the crayfish seem to hunker down. They'll basically get, underneath some kind of substrate debris and then hope for the best. And what they will also do, though, is they will move along the water's edge. So they'll, in response to flooding, and we actually did this with those animals that had radio transmitters. We had a couple flood events happen, and we were like, all right, let's go see what they're doing. And in that situation, what they did is they actually moved with the floodwaters out to the edge. And basically, they were staying in that kind of slow-moving bank water, for lack of a better word. I got another great example of them doing that. So my lab and I had a project in Big Thicket National Preserve, which is in East Texas. And we went down, and that was in 2014. And the Trinity River was experienced, and the Neches River were getting like 100-year flood. I mean, it was insane. The interstates were getting obliterated by the rivers. I mean, and I went down there and was like, what the hell am I doing here? There's so much water. We're not going to catch a crawdad. They can be anywhere. And we actually caught more crayfish on that trip than any collecting trip I've ever been a part of, because we figured out that, the crayfish are just following the edge of the water. So what would happen is we would, took us a while to figure out where the edge of the river was, because the Trinity River during that time became a lake. I mean, it was crazy. But when we finally were able to figure out, it's a mile that way, because the river was miles out of its bank, not just, it's right there. But we would find that edge, and we would grab dip net and just basically jab the dip net through what equated to yards and grasses and fields. The crayfish were right there, and we actually caught tons of them. So they do respond to that. The big thing that happens a lot of time with floodwaters, which we don't think about, is when you get a lot of floodwaters and a lot of sediment in the water and it's warm, the amount of oxygen in the water can actually drop precipitously. And these animals need air just like we do. And the neat thing about crayfish is that they can breathe out of water. As long as their gills are wet, they can grab oxygen out of the air, and it can go through water and pass through their gill membranes and get into their body. And a lot of times what will happen when you get those big flood events is you have things like burrowing crayfish, which are mud bugs. They make the chimneys along rivers and streams. You go in after one of these great big 100-year flood events, and you'll see just dead crayfish everywhere. And those animals have actually asphyxiated in their tunnels because this deoxygenated water takes out their burrows, and they can't get to the surface to breathe. So there's a biological response. So if you get a flood event, the crawdads are going to be right up at the edge. Now, this is also what can oftentimes cause invasions, because if you have a stream or river that gets out of its banks and spills into the river next door, crayfishes are going to be following along that high water mark. They're going to ultimately make their way into the next river, and you have a new invasion. And that has been done. So
yeah, at least that's an invasion though that we didn't.
Yeah, that's one that goes beyond.
Yeah, it's been happening for millions of years.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, cool. Well, thank you so much. Before we let you go too, if anybody's listening to this and they have their interest piqued on crayfish and they want to kind of seek out some more information on crayfish, is there anywhere you would direct folks to say, hey, here's some good sources to kind of do some reading up on?
There's so many, but there's not that many at the same time. So one way to figure out what crayfish live in your area, if you want to get a pattern, is you can actually use this app called iNaturalist. And if you type into iNaturalist crayfish, it will show you all the crayfish records from around you, and there'll be pictures of the crayfish. And at that point in time, you don't even necessarily have to identify them. If you just want to match a pattern to what's there, you can hit the picture, see what crawdad was caught there, and then try to match its pattern, the old-fashioned way. So that's one thing to do. There's plenty of internet resources that are available. There's lots of information about these invasive crayfishes. I would say it's real important for you as an angler to learn what they look like and make sure that you're not spreading them. That's important. And then you can always use my lab. My lab's available. We have a Facebook page, the Loughman Lab, the West Liberty University Crayfish Conservation Lab, all of that. You can type in Loughman Lab to Facebook. It normally pops up. And we get people messaging us all the time. I've got an army of grad students who look at that page. So if we have a question, we can answer it there. And then you can use me. My profession is teaching, so I don't mind talking about this stuff at all. So you can find me on Facebook, on Zach Loughman on Facebook, and then on Instagram, my handle is Dr. Crawdad. So if you go there, you can find me there as well, and just shoot me a DM or a PM. And, we can go from there. So I'm an extremely busy guy. Don't get pissed if I don't respond to you like in an hour. It might take me a day or two. When we're doing field work in Southern West Virginia, a lot of times we don't have Wi-Fi for like days. So just, know that. But I do I absolutely try to get a hold of everybody that reaches out.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a super, super enjoyable conversation. I know that people are going to love this. If there's anything we can help with too, obviously let us know. But that is our conversation with Dr. Zach Loughman. Zach, thanks so much.
Thank you, Andrew. It's been a pleasure.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to episode 2 of the Bait Breakdown, the Crawfish episode with Dr. Zach Loughman. Get ready. Next week on episode 3, we have a really cool conversation about aquatic insects with Dr. Sally Entrikin. But as always, thank you guys so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please head over to Apple, leave us a review. That helps a ton. Go subscribe on Apple, Spotify, iHeart, wherever you listen, and we will see you back here next week for episode 3 of the Bait Breakdown here on the Tackle Talk podcast.